The morning the boardroom went quiet was the morning everyone in that building learned something about assumptions they would spend years trying to forget. It began as most things do, without fanfare. The Hargrove Capitol Conference Room on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Chicago, and on a clear Tuesday in October, the light came in sideways and cold, landing on the long mahogany table where 9 of the sharpest financial minds in the Midwest were already seated and already irritated. The meeting had been called for 8 o'clock. By 8:12, the lead presenter had not arrived. The projector was throwing a blue error screen onto the far wall, and the catering service had sent up the wrong order, black coffee instead of the assorted selection that had been specified twice in writing. A man in gray coveralls moved quietly along the far edge of the room, gathering the unwanted cups onto a cart. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that didn't announce itself, strong jaw, close-cropped silver hair, reading glasses tucked into his chest pocket. His name badge said Ted. He had been working the building's facilities crew for 11 months, arriving before anyone else and leaving after most of the lights went dark. No one looked at him. That was not unusual. In 11 months, almost no one had. Raymond Voss, the managing director of Hargrove's acquisitions division, was at the head of the table looking at his phone, with the specific expression of a man who had decided in advance that this day would disappoint him. Beside him sat Carla Hutchins from legal, and across from her, 2 analysts in their late 20s who had been awake since 4 in the morning, running numbers on the Delvane Group proposal, the acquisition that was supposed to define Hargrove Capital's next decade. The Delvane deal was worth $3.7 billion. It was also, in the quiet opinion of the man in gray coveralls, fundamentally flawed. Ted Callahan had not always been Ted Callahan, the facilities worker, but that was not a story he had told anyone in this building, and he did not intend to start today. He lifted the cart and moved toward the service entrance, and that is where the story might have ended. Another Tuesday. Another room full of people who did not see what was directly in front of them, except that one of the junior analysts, a young woman named Priya, who had the anxious habit of talking to anyone nearby when she was nervous, looked up from her laptop and said, almost to herself, "I don't understand why the amortization schedule doesn't reconcile with the projected EBITDA. It's off by about $40 million and nobody can tell me why." She wasn't speaking to him, she was speaking to the air. Ted stopped. He stood with one hand on the cart's handle and looked at the whiteboard on the near wall, where someone had written out the acquisition structure in broad strokes: purchase price, assumed liabilities, projected synergies, the timeline for integration. He read it the way other people read a sentence. Quickly, completely, and then he saw it. "The depreciation basis is wrong," he said. The room didn't go quiet right away. It went quiet the way a room does when something is said that doesn't belong to the conversation that's happening. A beat of confusion first, then a gradual stillness as people registered the source. Priya turned around. Raymond Voss looked up from his phone. "Sorry," Voss said. Ted nodded toward the whiteboard. "The depreciation basis. Whoever built the model assumed straight line over 15 years on the Delvane manufacturing assets. But those assets were recategorized under the 2021 regulatory restructuring. They're depreciable over 7 years under MAX-ERS. The accelerated schedule changes your taxable income projection for the first 4 years, and that's where your $40 million goes." The room held its breath. Voss's expression moved through several stages. There was the initial dismissal, the instinct to look at the coveralls, the cart, the badge that said Ted. And there was something behind that instinct, a hesitation, because the man had said it without pausing, without checking anything, without a single waver of uncertainty. "You're talking about the modified accelerated cost recovery system," said one of the analysts, a young man named Derek, who had clearly decided to be the one who called the bluff. "I am," Ted said, "and you're saying our model has the wrong depreciation class on the tangible assets. I'm saying whoever pulled the asset register used the pre-2021 classification. If Delvane's manufacturing equipment was reclassified as 5-year property during the restructuring, which it was, it's in their 10 footnote 14, then your deferred tax liability in years 1 through 4 is significantly understated, which means your purchase price is overstated by somewhere between $38 and $42 million, depending on your discount rate assumptions." Derek opened his mouth and closed it again. Priya was staring. Carla Hutchins, who had been in corporate law for 21 years and could recognize the precise moment a deal changed shape, set down her pen. Raymond Voss stood up slowly. He was a tall man and he used his height in the way that men who've been managing directors for a long time learn to use it, as punctuation. "Who are you?" he said. "Ted Callahan. I do facilities." "I can see that." Voss's voice had an edge that people in his division recognized as the one he used when he was deciding whether to be angry. "What I'm asking is where you're getting this from." Footnote 14 of Delvane's most recent 10K filed in February. It's public record. You read Delvane's 10K. I read most of the 10Ks for companies in the industrial manufacturing sector, Ted said. It helps pass the time. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Derek. "Pull up foot 14. Derek's fingers were already moving. The room waited. Outside the window, a plane crossed the skyline, small and silver, catching the morning light. "He's right," Derek said. "The reclassification is in footnote 14. 5-year max MRS property. We pulled the asset data from the 2019 filing." He looked up. "We used the wrong source document." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. It was the silence of people doing rapid internal calculations, not mathematical ones, though there were those too, but the kind that involved reassessing what they thought they knew and who they thought they were dealing with. Carla Hutchins spoke first. "Mr. Callahan," she said with the careful tone of someone choosing their words, "what exactly did you do before facilities?" Ted unfolded his glasses from his chest pocket and set them on his face, a small, unhurried gesture. "Before this, various things, such as, I spent about 14 years as a restructuring advisor. Before that, I was a partner at a tax consultancy. Before that, I taught corporate finance at Northwestern for 6 years. He paused. Before that, I was a graduate student who read too many 10Ks. No one in that room spoke for a full 4 seconds. Priya finally said very quietly, "Why are you working facilities?" It was the question every person in the room was holding. Ted considered it with the patience of someone who had been asked it before in different forms, by different people who all believed that a man's worth could be read from his job title. "I had a difficult few years," he said. "My wife passed. I was in a car accident. I was out of the industry for a while, and coming back into it at my age, without wanting to make phone calls to former colleagues and ask for favors, is not a quick process." He said it without self-pity, which was the only way it could have been said and still been believed. "I applied to Hargrove's research division 3 months ago. I was told they weren't considering candidates over 55 without a current institutional affiliation." The room went very still. Voss, to his credit, did not look away. He absorbed that sentence with the expression of a man who was doing the uncomfortable work of connecting a policy to its consequences. "Who told you that?" "The HR coordinator." It was a form response. "I still have the email." Carla wrote something on her notepad. It was not a small note. Voss walked to the head of the table, and then, in a gesture that was either decisive or performative, probably both, he pulled out the chair directly to his right, the chair where his senior advisor usually sat, and said, "Sit down, Mr. Callahan." Ted looked at the cart, then back at Voss. "I still have 2 floors to do," he said. Someone at the far end of the table made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been shock absorbing itself. Priya pressed her lips together. "I think the floors can wait," Voss said. Ted sat down. What followed was 4 hours that no one who was in that room would describe accurately to anyone who wasn't, because the accurate description would require admitting how thoroughly one man with a cart and a badge that said Ted had dismantled a $3.7 billion model that a team of credentialed analysts had spent 6 weeks building. It wasn't that the model was wrong across the board. Most of it was sound, but there were 3 structural assumptions that cascaded. The depreciation issue Ted had spotted first, a second problem with how the deal accounted for Delvane's pension liability transfer, and a third, subtler issue with the revenue synergy projections that assumed customer retention rates from a 2018 study that predated Delvane's 2020 operational restructuring and therefore no longer reflected actual client behavior. Ted walked them through each one. He did not do it with triumph. He did not perform expertise. He simply sat in the chair to Voss's right and spoke in the measured, even voice of a man who had spent decades thinking carefully about numbers, and had long since stopped needing anyone to be impressed by it. Derek, who had come into the meeting intending to be the smartest person in the room, found that his instinct to resist had evaporated sometime around the second hour. He started asking questions instead. Good ones. Ted answered each one directly, sometimes with a clarifying question of his own, and by early afternoon the two of them were working through a revised integration model together, with the focused quiet of people who have forgotten to be aware of what they look like. Priya, at one point, left to get sandwiches. When she came back, she set one next to Ted without thinking about it, and he said, "Thank you," and kept talking, and she realized only later that she had done it with the same naturalness she would have used for a colleague she'd known for years. This was the thing about Ted Callahan that people struggled to articulate afterward. There was no moment where he seemed to be proving something. He was not performing humility, and he was not performing confidence. He was simply present, fully, quietly, completely, in the way that people are when they no longer need the external architecture of title and credential to tell them who they are. The meeting ended at 12:47. Voss asked Ted to stay as the others filed out. The room was quieter now, the way rooms get when the crowd leaves and the space expands back to its actual size. Outside, the Chicago skyline was brighter now, the morning's cold angle replaced by the flatter light of midday. "I owe you an apology," Voss said. He said it without a preamble, which suggested he had decided on it before he started speaking, which suggested it was real. "For what specifically?" Ted asked. "For the HR situation. Voss stopped and started again. "We have a policy that was supposed to streamline candidate review, and it's being applied in a way that filters out people it shouldn't. I wasn't aware of that. I should have been." Ted considered this. He did not rush to accept it or to dismiss it. He let it sit in the air for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved. "People make policies for a reason," he said finally. "The problem is usually that the reason gets forgotten and what's left is just a wall." "Yes," Voss said. "I'm not bitter about it," Ted said. "I want you to know that. I'm not sitting in a broken-down facility closet feeling sorry for myself. The work is honest. The people on the crew are good people. There are worse things than honest work." Voss looked at him steadily. "Would you be willing to come in as a senior consultant on the Delvane deal? On a contract basis to start. We'd need to revisit the model comprehensively before we go back to the board. I'd want to finish my shift first," Ted said. Voss blinked. Then he understood that Ted was not making a joke, or not only making a joke. "Of course," he said. "And I'd want it on the record that the initial error wasn't the analyst's fault. They pulled from the source they were given. The data management process is where the problem started." "That's fair. Derek's good," Ted added. "He asks the right questions once he stops trying to win." Voss nodded. He had noticed the same thing. Ted stood, folded his glasses back into his pocket, and retrieved his cart from where he'd left it by the service entrance. The room was empty now except for the two of them and the pale October light stretched across the table. "Mr. Callahan," Voss said. Ted turned. "The research division. I'd like to revisit that as well, on a permanent basis if you're open to it." Ted looked at him for a moment, not weighing whether to say yes, but weighing, it seemed, something else. Something slower and more internal. "Let me finish the floors," he said. "I'll let you know." He wheeled the cart out of the conference room, down the hallway, and to the service elevator. He pressed the button for the 38th floor. He stood quietly as the elevator rose. Through the small reinforced window in the elevator door, he could see the floors passing, each one a rectangle of pale fluorescent light. He was not thinking about the deal. He was not thinking about the offer. He was thinking about his wife, Ellen, who had told him once. On a Sunday morning in the kitchen of the house they'd owned in Evanston, drinking coffee while the neighborhood was still quiet, that the people who were most dangerous to underestimate were the ones who'd stopped needing to be seen. She had said it about someone else entirely, but Ted had carried it with him like a key that hadn't yet found its lock, and standing into that elevator in his gray coveralls with the 42nd floor and its long mahogany table somewhere above him, he thought that maybe, after all this time, he understood what she had meant. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto the 38th floor, which was dark except for the ambient light from the city coming through the windows and the small operational light of a printer left running. Ted guided the cart out of the elevator and into the hallway. He began where he always began, at the far end, working toward the light, The building was quiet. Below, the city was not. He worked the way he always worked, steadily, without hurry, with the attention he gave to everything, because he had learned in the years since Ellen died and the accident and the long gray passage of recovery that the quality of attention you brought to a thing was not something you could turn on selectively. You either brought it or you didn't. You either saw what was in front of you or you didn't. Most people didn't. That was not a criticism, it was just the way it was. The world moved fast and rewarded speed, and the things that asked for slowness, grief, detail, the footnote on page 47 of a regulatory filing, got skipped. Ted didn't skip them, he never had. He finished the 38th floor just before 2 o'clock. He took the elevator to 37. He worked through the afternoon the same way he had worked through every afternoon for 11 months. Without announcement, without complaint, without the posture of someone waiting to be discovered. He had not come here to be discovered. He had come here because he needed something to do with his hands and his hours while the rest of him figured out how to exist in a world that Ellen was no longer in. He had come here because the facilities director, a compact and practical man named George, who asked only whether you showed up on time and did the work cleanly, had hired him on a Tuesday afternoon without asking a single question about where he'd been before. That had meant something. It still did. At 4:30, Ted returned his cart to the facilities room in the basement, checked the log, and signed out. He changed out of his coveralls in the locker room, folded them carefully, and hung them on the hook with his name above it. He put on his regular clothes, dark slacks, a plain gray sweater, well-worn leather shoes that had been good shoes once. He took his coat from the hook and put it on. He stopped at George's office on the way out. George was at his desk, eating a sandwich and reviewing the next week's cleaning schedule. He was a man who did not require the world to be more dramatic than it was, which was part of why Ted liked him. "Good day?" George asked without looking up. "Interesting one," Ted said. "The meeting on 42 run long? They asked me to stay and help with something." George looked up then. He had worked facilities in various buildings for 30 years, and he had a way of reading between the lines that required no particular effort on his part. He looked at Ted with the expression of a man assembling a picture he had suspected was there. "They know who you are?" he said. "They know a little more than they did this morning," Ted said. George nodded slowly. He looked back down at his schedule. "You going to be leaving us?" Ted considered the question with the same unhurried care he gave to everything. "Probably," he said, "but not without notice, and not tomorrow." George's face did not change, but something in his posture settled the way a building settles in cold weather. Not a dramatic shift, just a small and final adjustment. "Fair enough," he said. Ted said good night and walked to the lobby and out through the revolving door onto LaSalle Street, where the early dark of October was already settling and the streetlights were lit and the city was going home. He walked 3 blocks to where his car was parked, a 2009 Volvo with a long scratch on the passenger side that he'd been meaning to address for 2 years, and got in and sat for a moment before starting the engine. In the window of the building across the street, he could see his own reflection. A man in a plain gray sweater and a coat that was older than it looked, sitting in a car that was older than it looked, in a city that had not known who he was for 11 months. He thought about calling his daughter, Renee, who lived in Portland and called him every Sunday and would want to hear about this. He thought about what she would say. She would probably say that she'd been telling him for 2 years to stop hiding. She would not say it unkindly, because Renee was not unkind. And she had gotten that from him, and he had never quite decided whether to feel proud of that or apologetic. He started the car. The engine turned over on the second try, as it always did. He pulled out of the spot and joined the slow tide of traffic moving north, and the city passed around him in its ordinary way. Lit windows, people at crosswalks, a delivery truck blocking the right lane on Illinois Street. And Ted Callahan moved through it like a man who had learned, at some cost, that the time you spent waiting to be seen by the right people was time that could have been spent simply doing the work. The work was still there in the morning. The work was always still there. What changed? What that Tuesday in October changed, in the quiet and unremarkable way that real things change, was not Ted. He was the same man who had folded his coveralls and signed the log and said goodnight to George. He was the same man who had shown up 11 months ago with no explanation, and asked for honest work and been given it. What changed was the room. The room that had not looked at him now, and it would keep looking, and that attention would carry with it the slow, uncomfortable work of understanding what it had missed and why, and whether the systems it had built to make decisions were actually doing what it believed they were doing. Raymond Voss would spend the better part of the following week reviewing HR intake policies. Carla Hutchins would flag 2 similar cases in the legal division and write a memo that moved quickly up the chain. Derek would tell the story, carefully, self-deprecatingly, to 3 different people in 3 different contexts over the next month, each time arriving at a slightly different understanding of what it meant. Priya would remember the sandwich. She would remember setting it down next to him without thinking, and she would remember that he'd said thank you without looking up, and she would understand later that this was what it looked like when someone had simply never needed the room's permission to belong in it. And Ted Callahan would go home to his apartment on the north side, make dinner, and read for a while before bed. He would call Renee on Sunday, as he always did, and he would tell her, in the measured, unhurried way he told her most things, that the week had been interesting. She would ask why, and he would think for a moment, the way he thought about everything, giving it the attention it deserved. And then he would say, "Someone finally asked the right question, and I was close enough to hear it." Knowledge does not wait to be invited. It simply is. In the footnote, in the overlooked filing, in the man standing quietly at the edge of the room with his hand on a cart, reading the numbers on the wall with the calm patience of someone who stopped needing to be noticed a long time ago. It was there the whole time. It is always there.